Thank you, Clay, for that very generous introduction. And thank you, Clay, for asking me to give this lecture. I'm very honored to be able to stand in front of this group and to be able to offer some of my thoughts about my recent experiences at the Veterans Hospital. Before I get started, of course, I'd like to honor Dr. Organ. I was lucky enough to know Dr. Organ. Dr. Organ did his medical school training at Creighton University and also his surgical training, and then stayed on there as the department chair till about 1982. I remember walking into his office as a fourth-year medical student applying for a residency position, and to suggest that Dr. Organ was larger than life doesn't do him justice. For those of us and those of you who did know him, he had a presence that was really unmatched. I think also it's important to recognize the contributions that he made to the surgical community. He was the editor of the Archives of Surgery for over 15 years. He developed 2 surgical programs. I mentioned Creighton. He also, after Creighton, went to the University of Oklahoma, where he worked, before moving on to East Bay in Oakland and developing and really evolving that surgical program into what it is today. He was the author of over 250 surgical papers, multiple books. He was instrumental in the founding of the Society of Black Academic Surgeons. And if you get into Dr. Organ's life, I think that the obstacles and the difficulties that he had as an African-American man moving into the community of academic surgery can only be recognized by the problems that he himself faced. Finally, I think the greatest tribute to Dr. Organ was given by his own residents when he did pass away very suddenly. In 2005, the Archives of Surgery dedicated an entire issue to his legacy. Multiple articles were written, and I think the greatest tribute to Dr. Organ came from his own residents, who stated that he would be alive through them every single day and all of the patients that they cared for. I give this lecture today in his memory, and I hope that he finds it acceptable. When Clay asked me to give this talk, I was obviously very honored, and then immediately, of course, perplexed as to what I was going to talk about. I went back and looked at multiple other previous Organ lectures and spent some time trying to sort through what exactly I would bring to this discussion today. About 18 months ago, I transitioned to the Veterans Administration Hospital. I had been a program director at St. Joseph Hospital in Denver. Many of you are familiar with it. I had a very nice position. I had great residents, great support, but I had never been in the military. I was surrounded by people that were in the military, and I admired them quite a bit. My son signed up and was deployed to Afghanistan for 18 months. He returned to us, and he was not hurt. Some of his fellow soldiers were injured, and I'll say that he wasn't hurt, but I do think he's changed. And I think that when I recognized in my own self a lack of contribution to what our country has given us, I did feel that there was a gap. Some of you know Tom Robinson. Tom is the current chief at the Veterans Hospital, and Tom called me and said, hey, I need somebody to be an assistant to work with residents and do some other things. And he said, would you be interested? Actually, he didn't say that. He said, I'm looking for someone. And he says, do you know anybody? And I said, yeah, me. So I went to work at the VA. Since I've been there, I've had an opportunity to do a number of things. One of those things is to become the Associate Chief of Staff. That's a very kind of presumptive title. I'm not sure exactly what it means, and I haven't been doing it very long. But through that, I have been exposed to the relationship with, of course, the University of Colorado. Also in my time there were some difficulties at the Oklahoma City VA, and I was asked to go to Oklahoma City to help with their surgical department. And it's not just through these experiences, it's also through the experiences that I think we've all recognized over the last several years, the problems that the VA has had. I'm not going to stand up here today and tell you that the VA doesn't have problems. It does. And we all know that they are profound and they affect a very vulnerable segment of our society. But at the same time, I do want to project to you that as members of the surgical community, members of the academic community, that we have a lot invested in the VA, and that the VA truly does matter to all of us and to the nation as a whole. The mission of providing health care to our veterans is embedded in our national consciousness. I don't think anybody said it obviously any better than Abraham Lincoln. These words, of course, came from his second inaugural address, and for those of you that have been to the Lincoln Memorial, it's engraved on the wall just behind his statue. And he said, "Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and his widow and his orphan." And that's the moral imperative that drives the Veterans Hospital today. The VA as we know it really came into being right after World War II. Care to veterans has been provided throughout our history. Certainly since the Revolutionary War, you can go in and identify a variety of different care kinds of modalities that were provided to our veterans. But really the VA as we know it came into existence in 1945. Omar Bradley, for those of you who don't remember or that doesn't ring a bell, was the commanding general of U.S. forces in Europe during World War II. When he returned, President Truman at the time appointed him as the chief administrator of the Veterans Administration. The VA was not yet a cabinet level position. And he identified a fellow by the name of Paul Hawley to run the Veterans Health Administration. And Dr. Hawley recognized the problems that were facing the delivery of care to essentially approximately 1 million soldiers returning from both the European and the Pacific theater at the end of 1945. He recognized that he had a massively undersized workforce. He didn't have much of an infrastructure to provide that care. And so what he decided to do was to develop an agreement with the academic institutions in our country, and it's memorialized again, and the internet's a wonderful thing to be able to find all these documents, in something called Policy Memorandum Number 2. I don't know what number 1 was, but number 2 is essentially a statement recognizing and defining the relationship that exists between the Veterans Administration and academic institutions. He essentially states that there will be problems, and I'll get into that a little bit more, but there must be tolerance for the solutions to be able to develop. And he also defined a threefold purpose of the affiliation: to provide high-quality care to the veterans, to provide for postgraduate medical training, particularly for the soldiers that were returning and had their training truncated, and I think all of us know multiple people who essentially participated in this type of training, and then raising the standards for medical practice through the U.S. by providing an educational experience to all of those individuals that would go out into the workforce. This was signed on January 30th of 1946, and again, to put it in the context, the war had ended in August of 1945. So within 5 months, these understandings were created. And so the placement of Veterans Administration hospitals in the proximity to medical schools and universities is not by chance. It's extremely intentional, and it was defined at this time. The organization of the VA is broken down, and just to give you a little bit of this background, the Department of Veteran Affairs was elevated to a cabinet-level position in 1988 by President Reagan. And the VA is overseen by the veterans, by the cabinet-level secretary. The Veterans Administration component of the VA is overseen by the Undersecretary for Veterans Health Administration. The Veterans Administration itself is broken down into three parts: the Veterans Health Administration, the Veterans Benefits Administration, and then the cemetery. The Veterans Benefit Administration is the larger component in terms of the budgetary requirements. The Veterans Health Administration, though, is obviously what we are most concerned with here today. This is our current Secretary of the Veterans Administration, Dr. Shulkin. Some of you may know Dr. Shulkin. Dr. Shulkin came out of the University of Pennsylvania. He is a physician. I say that because I think that's a good thing for the Veterans Health, or for the Veterans Administration, to have that person, that kind of person. He directed a large multi-specialty group across the East. He was the he was the Undersecretary for the Veterans Health Administration for the last 8 years. So who gets health care? One of the things I found when I went to the VA is that, and as I must say, I also, as a student and a resident, worked in the VA. I didn't really know who was eligible for care. And I started asking around, and nobody really seemed to know. And so I thought it might be helpful just to point out who does, or who is eligible. Who do we care for in the VA? Well, we care for veterans. But who is a veteran that gets care? We all know that not all of them are eligible for care. And essentially, anybody who participated in an active duty position prior to 1980 for even just one day is eligible for Veterans Health benefits. Now, not everybody gets full benefits, but they're all eligible for benefits. And that fulfills the prime purpose of the Veterans Hospital, to provide care for all veterans. If you have been in the reserves or the National Guard, you are also eligible, but only if you fully completed the deployment that you were called up to ask to participate in during your time in either of those organizations. So essentially, if you were in an active duty position and received a discharge other than dishonorable, you are eligible for veterans benefits. So who do we care for? We care for 9.2 million veterans, those who are currently signed up. There's 22 million veterans in the U.S. There are 25 million dependents to those. Now, we don't provide care to all those dependents, but to a significant component we do, and I'll define that. There's currently 152 acute care hospitals, and there's 1,700 other care sites. And in VA lingo, there's a lot of acronyms for these various places, but essentially that's where the care is currently being delivered. So again, who is eligible? Who gets care? Essentially any veteran who cannot afford to pay for their care. Who gets full benefits? Anybody that has a rating of 50% or higher. And who gets rated? The Veterans Benefit Administration is the individuals that decide who gets that kind of rating. And so when it's applied for, there is an assessment that's done in regards to, at the time of their discharge, whether or not there is an ongoing disability. Also, care is provided specific to the conditions that are officially rated as service-connected. So in other words, if a soldier loses his hearing due to exposure to artillery activity, that service-connected disability is covered for the rest of their life. Mental health issues are covered for all of them. And I'll say this, and I'll bring it up again. The discussion about PTSD and mental health issues in the VA is real. I wasn't sure I knew. I grew up at a time through the Vietnam era. I was in medical school and through the residency at the end of the Vietnam conflict, and we saw many, many soldiers with a lot of various problems, addiction problems, etc. Today we see problems with a lot of this PTSD, and I'll just say this, that it is absolutely real and remarkable in the way it affects and adversely affects many of these men and women's lives. Also, a variety of exposures. We've all heard about Agent Orange. It's probably the most significant one. And there are multiple conditions associated with the exposure to Agent Orange, and those individuals are also covered. In regards to dependents, dependents are covered if indeed they are dependent, if their primary reason for dependence is related to a soldier who is totally disabled due to a service-connected disability. They are also eligible for 100% care. If the individual soldier who had that 100% disability passes away at the time, at any time, they then continue on with that health care benefit. If the soldier died of a service-connected disability, again, their dependents receive care. And of course, if the soldier dies while on active duty, they are eligible for care. But not everybody gets it for free. And again, this was something I didn't know, and we weren't sure. Certain veterans do have to pay for their care. They pay for their care if they have no VA-rated disability. I'm sorry. I think that's Jason Clark. If they have no VA pension, then they also get means tested. And if they have no special disability or no special eligibility. Special eligibility would be if they received such thing as a Purple Heart, or if they were in a combat zone and discharged within 5 years of the time of the application for the care. And very briefly, what do they pay? Essentially, it is means tested, and you'll hear this discussed upon various times about veterans. In other words, we have to go through a means test, or they'll put their travel to a means test. Essentially, what they are doing is looking at their household income and making a determination about their deductibles. So they do have deductibles, and they do have some co-pays. And the co-pays are maxed out at $700 a year, and generally it's $15 for their primary care, $50 for specialty care, and most medications are covered to the tune of about $9 per prescription. So what money goes into the VA? Quite a bit. Some people will say too much, but this is what the budget was for 2017. In 2017, there was $66.4 billion committed to the Veterans Health Administration. That was out of a total budget of $181 billion. And the pie chart on the right shows you where that money goes. Now, this doesn't include research or other benefits. The proposed benefit, and I pulled this from the Wall Street Journal about 2 weeks ago, is $78.9 billion. And that's an increase of about 5.9%. Now, that's proposed and not necessarily what's going to be passed through. So to get on to the meat of the discussion, in 2014 there was quite a dust-up. We all know about the problems that the VA identified, that they didn't identify, but other people identified in terms of access to care. Those of us in Colorado are very familiar with the problems associated with the building of the new hospital. You can see here in the upper right corner. That hospital is being built. It's multiple years overdue, and it's about $1 billion over budget. And that's a problem. And I think we need to recognize these problems, but what I hope to do in the next few minutes is to convince you that our relationships with the VA, and the VA as it is a very important institution that needs to be maintained. The VA is committed to 3 foundational missions. First and foremost, most important of those, of course, is the care of the veteran. But it's also dedicated to research, and I'll get into that in more detail. And that is, again, significantly aligned with the academic affiliates. It's also dedicated to education. I don't well, there's a few people in this room, but I think the majority of people in this room probably, I was sitting at dinner last night and talking to Dr. Russell, Dr. Nelson, and myself. All three of us had participated in some way or another in training or employment at the VA. And I think that's a common experience for many of us. Lastly, it is dedicated to medical preparedness in the case of a attack or conflict. So what's the primary mission? Well, the primary mission, again, is to improve the health care of the veteran. And in terms of research, that is dedicated to research that is dedicated to that health improvement. It's also dedicated to apply the scientific knowledge to develop effective individualized care solutions for veterans. And it's also very important to recognize that within the VA structure, that it is designed to attract, train, and retain the highest caliber investigators and nurture their development as leaders within the academic and medical community so that they can, if they stay, provide that care to veterans, if not, move on to provide it to the nation as a whole. Also, it's dedicated to assure the appropriateness of the research that's being performed, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But I think it's also very important for those individuals who are working with either junior faculty or others who are committed to research within the VA to recognize that the VA does have a very specific focus in regards to that research. And that research is dedicated to the healthcare issues, to the veteran community itself, and or the rehabilitation of those soldiers who have been injured in the conflict most recently and or in the past that they have experienced. And so as research is applied for and or research grants are applied for and or requested, it needs to be kept in context of those parameters. The Office of Research and Development is broken down into 4 different arms. There's the biomedical or basic science arm, the clinical science, which is individual trials, and those are the merit grants for which most people are familiar. There's the multi-center trials, which again are well known. I know one of the most significant papers I've read that still affects my practice today is the multi-center trial that was done by Lee Newmeyer, member of this group, as well as Bob Fitzgibbons, looking at various hernias across a multitude of veterans hospitals. Also, of course, the health services and rehabilitation. So essentially all research grants fall into those buckets. So how does the VA participate? Well, currently there are some 2,000 active projects at approximately 100 sites. So it is wide in regards to its distribution. The total budget for the VA in 2016 was $1.8 billion dedicated to these arms of the research. I think it's also very important to recognize that all 1A facilities, and 1A facilities are the facilities that you are most familiar with. Most people don't recognize the classification scheme that the VA uses, but all of their acute care facilities are broken down into a variety of complexities in regards to the procedures that they can perform. The major hospitals are 1A facilities, and all of those people have an associate chief of staff for research and development who oversees all research projects for the facility. Probably most important, they are there to facilitate the development of grants and the submission of grants to the appropriate channels so that those grants can be awarded. So how do you get a grant? Well, there are 2 applications periods, September and March for the clinical and basic science, of which the majority of the grants are submitted. December and June for the health sciences and research, or excuse me, rehabilitative research. This is an important point. To be able to be awarded a grant, you need to have 5/8 time. And again, I was talking to Dr. Nelson last night, and I must admit, when I went to the VA, I had no idea how they broke down times, and everything's done in 8s. I can't explain that to you, but everything is done in 1/8, 3/8, or as I pointed out here, 5/8. But to be able to be eligible for a grant, you need to have a 5/8 appointment to the Veterans Administration. Clinicians are expected to have at least 2/8 of that in clinical service. So in other words, they need to spend at least a quarter of their time in some form of clinical service. That means going to the clinic, going to the operating room, but 2/8 time. The work should ideally be done on the VA grounds if it does require any kind of basic science work. It is important to recognize that MDs and PhDs are handled a little bit separately. I don't want to go too much into the PhDs, but we can certainly pursue that. If you have a question for it, please feel free to ask me. But the important part here is that if you are a 5/8 time, 3/8 of that time is guaranteed protected time to the research for your salary. And so the VA has a very significant component in that a significant portion of the grant, as I said, 3/8 of it can be dedicated to the salary. In addition to that, the affiliate or the individual can still maintain their privileges and work at the academic affiliate based upon a 40-hour work week. And this gets into the way the VA looks at various work and how that work is delivered. Specifically, what I'm referring to is the ability to be able to work in 2 sites and receive dollars for that work received from the government. There does need to be an awareness of the fact that the government does look at the potential for fraud and abuse in the development or the delivery of care. What I get at here is that if the individual is providing care in one site and is expected to be at another site providing care that is funded through dollars that either come from the VA or CMS, which is the Medicare funding source, of course, then there is a concern about the potential for abuse. The VA also does tend to fund other types of activities, and I've listed them here towards the bottom. If you're a VA co-investigator, you can have 1/8 protected time in your facility. And I think, again, all of us recognize as I go through this listing that protected time is up to the individual, and that's a very difficult concept for everyone. But it is important to recognize that this is funding that goes directly to the salary of that individual. So if you're a mentor for a VA funded as the primary investigator, if you're on the IRB, if you chair the IRB, if you're a member or these other committees, then you also have funding for that work. In addition, there's a very significant program, career development program, and it's available to physicians, PhDs, nurses, as well as PharmDs. And that's a 6/8 protected time. This is a very significant award because, again, it does cover salary, and it's also dedicated to a 6-year duration. So if a person receives this is a significant award. The other really significant component about, and I talked with Bob Keith, who is our ACOS for research in Denver, is that at the end of this term, they are guaranteed employment in whichever service that they are granted the award. So in other words, if it's in a pulmonary critical care position, if it's in a surgical position, even though they spend the majority of their time in the research arm, that when they are done, they are guaranteed a clinical position at the completion of the study. So what kind of achievements has the VA done? What are they contributing? In 2010, 7,000 publications had a VA address as their listing in the PubMed publication. The Office of Research and Development received 10 patents, received 31 applied for 31 patents, and received 169 licenses. They conducted 28 phase 4 clinical trials and completed 11 of those. In a study that was done by the VA to evaluate the research program, they found it was a very significant component of attracting people to the VA as well as retaining them at the VA. I think that's a very important point, again, for academic affiliates to look at the VA as a potential training ground, obviously, for junior faculty, when positions are available. It's not all candy canes and lollipops. There's some problems. We all know that the VA and the government in general has a lot of restrictions. And so when they did the study and looked at the researchers and asked them, how do you spend your time, 10% of their time was spent on compliance, and that's within their own study. 38% they spent it on research, 18% were spent on clinical duties. What were they dissatisfied with? The amount of time they had to spend on compliance. They felt it was over the top. They also have to go through the same kind of training, and most of us go through some form of online training these days. In our world, it's called TMS, or Talent Management System. I think that's a bit of an oxymoron. But the point being is that there's no kind of culling or discretionary application of those types of studies. And I think lastly, and I get to this a little bit more, is our IT. If anything that the VA could do over the next 10 years would be to modernize the IT systems. Right now they're in place and they were novel when they were developed, but they're far behind the times. And essentially that's what this demonstrates, that most of the improvements should be directed at the IT. Moving on to education and to define that application and the importance to our community. The VA has been involved in education for over 70 years. Approximately 70% of all physicians received either part of their training while they were at the VA. It's had some significant contributions along the way. I've got a picture of Dr. Hawley up there, and I apologize for the way it projects, but I think the couple things that I do want to call out. I mentioned the IT. The VA was the first broad institution to have an electronic medical record. That came in the early 80s and has been applied throughout. Again, the unfortunate part is that it's still probably about the same model that we had back then. But I think also one of the really significant components was the development of VASQIP. VASQIP is the Veterans Administration Surgery Quality Improvement Project. From VASQIP came NISQIP. And I think that what we're seeing with these types of quality incentive measures and what the VA can say is that we still use that data literally on an everyday basis when we look at it. And I think our VASQIP is even better than NISQIP in that we get our data after 3 months. It's not 6 months or 9 months later. It's within 3 months, and we're able to react to it. It's a living, breathing kind of document for us that we look at and try to mitigate on an ongoing basis. The educational enterprise is embedded again, or a part of the U.S. Code. U.S. Code is part of our law. And the 38th, or Title 38, is the GI Bill. And it's in the GI Bill that the VA is committed to education. And as it writes at the bottom of this slide, to the extent feasible without interfering with the medical care and treatment of veterans, shall develop and carry out a program of education and training of health personnel. Graduate medical education is a significant enterprise within the VA. There's currently 41,000, or in 2014 there were 41,223 medical residents, 22,931 medical students, 311 advanced fellows, all of which were participating at various levels throughout the VA. In total, when you look at 2015 numbers, over 120,000 learners are involved in some form of postgraduate education at the VA. It is the single largest educational enterprise in the country. Out of 141 of our allopathic medical schools, 135 of them have affiliated agreements. 35 of 40 osteopathic medical schools have agreements. And agreements for training are with 152 other VHA, or Veteran Health Administration, medical centers, hospitals, and independent outpatient clinics. Again, just to emphasize the point in regards to the participation of the VA in our medical education process. Why is that important? I stole this slide from the ACGME, and I talked to Dr. Potts before he left. He's not here today. I'm disappointed because I'd like to hear what he had to say. And what I want to move into is why I think the VA has a significant piece or a significant component of participation within the education of our residents. If you look at the origin of the X and Y axis on this slide, you'll see that it starts at a very low level. Essentially, that's our first year or second year medical student. And it's got a trajectory lined on it as it increases in decision making and independence to this fully functioning attending individual through the trajectory. All of us that are involved in education know that this line is not like this. In other words, it's up and down and such, but the idea is to end up at this point of the fully autonomous individual. I put this little cartoon in to show our resident going to sleep on June 30th. He's a senior resident or chief resident who goes to sleep, and he wakes up as an attending, a fully competent and fully functioning attending surgeon. That's our goal, of course, within the educational process. But as we all know, or we have the perception, that this isn't necessarily occurring. Many of you know John Tarpley. Dr. Tarpley has been involved in resident education for many, many years, very active in the Association of Program Directors in Surgery in Nashville. And he was participating in a paper that looked at resident autonomy and the development of that autonomy. And it's felt that, at least in this paper, that residents are not being allowed to progress in a graded responsibility through their residency. They had a lot of reasons as to why that doesn't occur. And paraphrasing some of those reasons, I think we all know that what's happened is a proliferation of highly complex procedures and training institutions. What do I mean by that? When I was a resident, back in we still had electric lights, residents were, all first-year residents did appendectomies. We did it through a right lower quadrant incision. We tended to do those operations. Same with hernias. Heck, hernias today are being done with robots. Who's doing those? Well, maybe the fellows doing them, or certainly senior residents. Same thing with appendectomies. We don't take out appendices anymore. We take them out with laparoscopes. What's happened is that we've taken a lot of cases away from our junior residents because of the development of our technology. And I think that's lent itself into a stunting of their development, at least from a technical aspect, over time. I think there's also a significant enhanced pressure on attendings for outcomes by their institutions, case volume, and their own professional development. In other words, we have populated a lot of our institutions, rightfully so, particularly our academic institutions, as we have seen massive growth in these institutions over the last several years, with a lot of junior faculty. And junior faculty are looking at and recognizing that they need to do their own cases. So what's happening is that we're not seeing all these cases being done by residents. We also know, and we've heard it in this conference, that there's a significant amount of pressure on individuals to provide economic income or economic drive, money in the door for their institutions. Of course, government regulations play into this, as well as hospital bylaws. I think also it's important to recognize that resident autonomy is broken down into really two parts. I think most of us feel that our residents get a lot of care on the floors and in wards and et cetera, and develop a lot of skill and ability in their cognitive ability. What I'm talking about mostly is their technical ability. And again, I think as I have worked with multiple residents over the years, I think they're extremely technically sound. Occasionally there's residents that do have difficulty, no question about it, but the overwhelming majority are very technically sound. What I'm concerned about sometimes is their confidence to be able to carry that out. And I do think that's what autonomy tends to bring to residents, is that confidence that when they're out there at 2 in the morning by themselves with a very difficult situation, they have the confidence to be able to make the right choices. So how do we do this? Well, we develop a culture within the institution to recognize resident autonomy. I think also through evaluations and curricula that are designed to develop that autonomy is also a very important part. But resident autonomy and changing a culture, that's a difficult thing. This is a diagram demonstrating how culture within an organization can change, and there's multiple components. What I'm going to get at here is that the VA already has that in place. This is pulled from one of our handbooks. Again, in the VA, you can't go to the bathroom without a handbook. But this handbook is directed specifically at resident supervision. And within that handbook, it states very clearly that the process of progressive responsibility is the underlying educational principle for all graduate medical education and health professional education, regardless of specialty or discipline. It's written in our laws. And as a resident, trainees acquire the knowledge and judgment that accrue with experience, they are allowed the privilege of increased authority for patient care. It's an expectation within the VA that residents progress, that they move on in autonomy. It comes down from the chief of staff on down. It's part and parcel of what goes on in the institutions on a daily basis. Now, I don't want to get outside the side that there isn't appropriate supervision, but because I think as we all talk about autonomy, one of the keys is to make sure that we keep the patient safe. The patient always has to be safe. We have to keep that as a guiding principle. But at the same time, we need to entrust the residents in regards to the ability to provide that care. This is also taken from one of our handbooks, and this is a scheming system or stratification that occurs within our operating room. So in other words, again, it's in part and parcel of the VA culture to allow for residents to be able to function in an independent manner as they progress through their years of responsibility. Lastly, again, to develop resident autonomy, we need entrustment, we need better evaluations, we need rotational curricula that allow for the development. And I think lastly also, and I will ask our academic affiliates, and I do stress this, I think we need to do a much better job of faculty development. I remember one time walking out of a conference with one of our senior, extremely well-respected surgeons. We were talking about resident instruction and such, and he looked at me and said, well, everybody knows how to teach. And I would beg to differ with that kind of idea. Not everybody does, and not everybody wants to, but I really think what we need to do is identify the individuals that do and teach them how to teach. In a time when we have a constraint on the amount of time that residents can spend in an educational enterprise, we need to make the most out of every experience that they have. We owe it to them. I think also to recognize that the VA is one of the few places where we're seeing an expansion of resident positions. CMS isn't expanding a single position. That's where most of the money comes from. But the VA is. They have dedicated 1,500 new positions, mostly in primary care specialties, but they're open to everybody. One of the things I've learned as my academic affiliate, I'm looking at these various applications for, and they are available to the affiliates. The VA does very little sponsoring, and essentially no sponsoring of any GME positions, and these are open to individuals for application. In terms of learner perceptions, I think most of us have had a good experience, but remarkably in surgery, we're the lowest on the chain over here. This was taken from 2016 in terms of learner prevention, and I must admit I've looked at the most recent one for 2017. I didn't put it in, but the return on these surveys is very low, and so I question a little bit of the validity. But suffice it to say that overwhelmingly individuals that work and learn in the VA have a good experience. Lastly, I think it's also important in the educational realm to call out what goes on in regards to funding for our part-time faculty. This is our own institution. This is the money that goes from the Denver VA to our academic affiliate. And you can see the dollars. If you multiply that out, what we're talking about is close to $500 million that is contributed by the VA back to academic affiliates across our country. And lastly, probably the most important part of what we do and what our residents do and what we all do is care for our veterans. It's our primary directive. And I think, again, I've alluded to the fact that we need to avoid unnecessary delays. We need to find solutions to provide that care appropriately for these individuals who have sacrificed so much for us. We need to improve our current system. We need to continue to look at choice, and choice is a program through which veterans can go outside of the VA. We need to open the referral to potentially other private health care. But I do put up dissolve the VA, and I don't think that's a reasonable solution. I don't think it's the right solution for the care of these individuals. Just to point out a couple things that the VA has done. In March of 2014, there were 4.5 million completed appointments in the entire clinic system. In March of 2016, that was increased by 14% to 5.3. We are making significant efforts to ensure that when individuals contact the VA, that they are seen in a timely manner. Choice referrals, again, the choice system is the ability for a veteran to go outside the VA. And 130,000 of those in March of 2014, and that's when it was developed. In March of 2016, it's been doubled by close to 50%. Here are completed appointments in less than 30 days, 96%. When an individual contacted the VA at their request or the clinically indicated date, in other words, when it was needed, 96% of those appointments were completed in less than 30 days. 90% less than 14, 85 less than 7, same day, 22%. The VA has developed same-day care in the primary care world. This is choice, the parameters for choice. In other words, for a veteran to be able to go out, everybody wonders how they go out, where they go out. Essentially, if we cannot provide them with an appointment within 30 days or a surgical appointment within 30 days of their clinic visit, they have the capacity to go out. Now, I'm not going to say it's a perfect system, but it does exist. Also, if they live 40 miles or greater than the care site. Also, important to recognize that providers, to be able to give that choice care, do need an agreement with the VA. As I mentioned earlier, care for the veteran, and I do think is provided best within the VA for a number of reasons. One of those is this PTSD problem. It's a significant issue. In our clinics, as we all know, we kind of chuckle about it, but it's real. And some of the problems that occur there, and unfortunately, the suicide rate amongst veterans directly related to this problem is significant. In the general population, the suicide rate was 15.2 for 100,000 individuals. It was greater than double that in the VA. In my time at the VA in the last 18 months, we've had 3 deaths in our facility alone. They're homeless, they have significant acuity of disease, they're marginalized, they have a lack of resources, they require enormous resources, and again, I think this is best delivered within the Veterans Administration where these systems are already set up. I will caution people about the Stark Law and choice referral for our affiliates. I don't want to go into this too much, but it needs to be recognized that there can't be self-referrals. And lastly, this is very personal. This is Khyber Pass. I don't know if any of you know where Khyber Pass is. Maybe some of you do. But it's the old ancient pathway between northern India and Afghanistan. It exists in the area kind of right up in here. I've marked here, this is Bagram. Bagram is one of the bases that our soldiers went to during the Operation Enduring Freedom. So in other words, the war in Afghanistan. That's where my son was deployed. This is his battalion. He was in the 82nd Airborne and deployed with this group. These are the people we're taking care of. They're our brothers, our sons, our cousins, our uncles. We owe it to them to provide the best care we can. And how do we do that? Well, I think we do it with the best and the brightest. This is our recent resident group. They're a fabulous group of individuals. I'm privileged to be able to work with them every day. they're motivated, they're intelligent, they're happy. I think that for them to be exposed to this group and to provide that care does a lot for them. I know it did a lot for me. I think also something that doesn't get recognized or seen is the fact what it does for our veterans. I think we've all seen our veterans when we walk into a group or a large group walks into a room, how they brighten up, how they cheer up. And I think it does mean a lot to them. I think they recognize through that interaction that they are seeing the best and the brightest, that we are dedicating our best and our brightest to their care. I think that that in many ways is immeasurable. In conclusion, the care of our veterans is embedded in our culture. We have a symbiotic relationship between the Veterans Health Administration and our academic affiliates. We need to continue to work together to solve the problems of both of us in regards to the delivery of this care. And as we stand here in Hawaii, a mere few miles from the memorial to probably the greatest generation and the efforts that they provided to preserve our liberty, I thank you for the opportunity to provide this talk. Thank you very much.